The pain started like a knife twisting in my chest at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March. I remember the exact time because I was staring at the old digital clock on my nightstand, watching those red numbers blur as my vision started to fade. 68 years on this earth, and I'd never felt anything like it. The crushing weight pressing down on my ribs, the burning sensation spreading down my left arm like liquid fire. I knew what this was. I wasn't stupid. This was the big one, the heart attack that had been lurking in my family's DNA for generations, waiting for its moment to strike. But here's what I didn't expect. Here's the part that still haunts my dreams and makes me question everything I thought I knew about the person I raised. When I called out for help, when I begged my own flesh and blood to save my life, he looked me dead in the eyes and walked away. Not only did he walk away, he locked the door behind him. He took my phone. And he left me there to die. If you've ever trusted someone with your entire heart, only to have them betray you in your darkest moment, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because what I'm about to tell you will shake you to your core, and you're going to want to remember where you heard it first. This isn't just another family drama story. This is about discovering that the monster you fear most might be sleeping down the hall. My name is Frank Castellano, and I'm 71 years old now. 3 years have passed since that night, but I can still feel the cold metal of that door handle refusing to turn, still hear my own voice echoing off those four walls as I screamed for mercy that never came. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, and let me tell you something, mine has been freezing for 1,000 days. I need to back up and tell you how we got here, because none of this makes sense without understanding who Danny was before he became the person who tried to kill me. Danny Castellano, my only son, my pride and joy, the kid I worked 3 jobs to put through college. The boy I taught to ride a bike in the parking lot behind Salvatore's Deli when he was 6 years old, his little hands gripping those handlebars so tight his knuckles went white. I ran beside him for what felt like miles that day, holding on to the back of his seat, promising I wouldn't let go until he was ready. When I finally did let go, and he kept pedaling on his own, the smile that spread across his face was brighter than every sunrise I'd ever seen. That was the Danny I knew. That was the son I loved. But people change. Money changes people. Desperation changes people. And sometimes, the people we love most become unrecognizable shadows of who they used to be. I just never imagined how dark that shadow could become. See, Danny had always been what you might call ambitious. Even as a kid, he was the type who wouldn't just play Monopoly. He'd create elaborate strategies, form alliances, then break those alliances when it served his interests. I used to think it was cute, this ruthless streak in my gentle boy. I used to brag to my friends at the auto shop about how smart he was, how he was going to be somebody important someday. I was so proud of his cunning, his determination to win at any cost. I should have paid more attention to that last part, any cost. After his mother died when he was 16, cancer took Linda in just 8 months, faster than we could even process what was happening. Danny became more distant, more calculating. I understood it at the time. Grief does strange things to people, especially teenagers. I gave him space. I figured he'd come back to himself eventually, that the warmth would return to those dark eyes that looked so much like his mother's. But instead of coming back, he just kept drifting further away, like a boat whose anchor line had been cut. College was supposed to fix that. NYU Business School, full ride scholarship because his grades were perfect and his entrance essay was a masterpiece about overcoming adversity. I was so proud the day we drove him to campus, his car packed with everything he owned, ready to start his new life. I hugged him goodbye in front of his dormitory, and for just a moment, I felt like I had my son back. He hugged me tight, told me he loved me, promised to call every week. He kept that promise for exactly 2 months. The calls became less frequent, then sporadic, then almost non-existent. When I did hear from him, it was always brief, always distracted. He was busy with internships, busy with networking events, busy building his future. I understood. I was proud. My boy was making something of himself in the big city, and I was just a small-town mechanic who'd never been further than Atlantic City. What did I know about his world? What I didn't know was that Danny had discovered something during his sophomore year that would change everything. He'd discovered just how much money his old man was worth. You see, I'd spent 35 years working on cars, saving every penny I could, investing in a few properties around town when the market was low. Nothing fancy, nothing glamorous, just a man trying to build something for his family's future. I owned the auto shop outright, had paid off the house years before Linda died, and owned 4 rental properties that brought in steady income. By the time Danny was in college, I was worth just over $2 million on paper. Not enough to be rich, but enough to be comfortable, enough to never worry about money again. I'd planned to tell Danny about the inheritance eventually, maybe when he graduated, maybe when he got married. I wanted it to be a surprise, a safety net that would let him chase his dreams without worrying about failure. I thought I was being a good father, protecting him from the burden of knowing, letting him build his own character through struggle and hard work. But Danny found out anyway. He'd always been good with computers, and during his junior year, he somehow accessed my financial records. Bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds, he saw it all. And instead of talking to me about it, instead of asking questions or expressing gratitude, he started planning. Planning how to get his hands on that money as quickly as possible. The first sign that something had changed was during his senior year. He started visiting more often, but these weren't the warm family visits I'd hoped for. These were calculated, strategic encounters. He'd arrive with a notebook full of questions about my health, my insurance policies, my estate planning. He said he was taking a class on financial planning and wanted to help me get organized. Sweet boy, looking out for his old man. I was so naive. So trusting. So completely blind to what was really happening. Danny graduated summa cum laude and immediately got a job at a prestigious investment firm in Manhattan. 6-figure starting salary, expense account, company car, everything a father could hope for his son. But it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough, because Danny had done the math. He'd calculated exactly how long it would take him to earn what I already had, and he didn't want to wait. He started visiting every month, then every 2 weeks. Always with some new concern about my health, some new suggestion about how I should update my will, some new idea about how we should restructure my assets for tax purposes. He brought lawyers to the house, his friends from law school, he said, who happened to specialize in estate planning. He scheduled doctor's appointments for me with specialists who happened to be experts in geriatric health issues. I thought he was being caring. I thought he was finally becoming the responsible adult son I'd always hoped for. I had no idea he was building a case, documenting every ache and pain, every moment of forgetfulness, every sign that I might be declining mentally or physically. The last time I saw Danny before that terrible night, he'd brought me a new cell phone. A fancy smartphone to replace my old flip phone, he said. He spent hours setting it up, showing me how to use it, installing apps that would help me stay connected with him. He even convinced me to download some kind of medical alert app that could monitor my heart rate and detect falls. I thought it was thoughtful. I thought it was love. I didn't realize until much later that he'd also installed tracking software, call monitoring programs, and remote access tools that would let him control my phone from anywhere. He'd essentially turned my lifeline into his surveillance system, a digital leash that would let him know exactly when and how to strike. The night it happened, I'd been having chest pains on and off for about a week. Nothing serious, I thought, just stress from dealing with a difficult tenant who was behind on rent, just the normal aches and pains of getting older. But Danny had been monitoring my health data through that app, and he knew something I didn't know. He knew that my heart was sending warning signals, that my body was building towards something catastrophic. And instead of warning me, instead of helping me get medical attention, he saw an opportunity. That Tuesday night, he showed up at my house around 10 p.m. Unexpected visit, he said. He was in the neighborhood, wanted to check on his old man. We sat in the living room watching the late news, sharing a beer, talking about his job and my latest car project. For a moment, it felt like old times. For a moment, I felt like I had my son back. But I noticed things. Little things. The way he kept checking his watch. The way he positioned himself between me and the door. The way he moved my landline phone from the kitchen counter to a shelf I couldn't easily reach. The way he kept asking me if I was feeling all right, if I was experiencing any pain or discomfort. At the time, I thought he was being attentive. Now I know he was waiting. Around midnight, he suggested I go to bed early. Said I looked tired, said he'd lock up and let himself out. I hugged him goodnight, told him I loved him, thanked him for visiting. As I walked toward my bedroom, I heard him making a phone call, but I couldn't make out the words. 3 hours later, the pain hit like a freight train, and my world changed forever. When I cried out for help, when I called his name from my bedroom, he appeared in my doorway almost instantly. Like he'd been waiting just outside, listening for exactly this moment. He stood there in the shadows, fully dressed, wide awake, and completely calm. That's when I knew. That's the moment when everything clicked into place, when I realized that this wasn't a coincidence, wasn't bad timing, wasn't an accident. This was planned. This was deliberate. This was attempted murder. And my own son was the one holding the weapon. The first words out of my mouth when I saw Danny standing in my doorway were probably the most pathetic thing I've ever said. Thank God you're here. Even as my chest felt like it was being crushed in a vice, even as my vision started to tunnel and my left arm went completely numb, my first instinct was relief. My son was here. My boy would save me. Everything would be okay. His response still echoes in my ears like a death sentence. I know exactly what's happening to you, Dad. Not. What's wrong? Not. I'll call 911. Not. Hold on, I'll get help. He said he knew exactly what was happening. Like he'd been expecting it. Like he'd been waiting for it. I tried to sit up in bed, but the pain drove me back down onto the pillows. My breathing was getting shallow, rapid, and I could taste something metallic in my mouth. Blood, maybe, or just pure terror. Danny, I gasped. I need you to call an ambulance. I think I'm having a heart attack. He stepped into the room slowly, deliberately, like he was savoring the moment. In the dim light filtering through my bedroom window, I could see his face clearly for the first time, and what I saw there made my blood run colder than the pain already had. There was no panic. No fear. No concern. Just a cold, calculating expression that I'd never seen on my son's face before. I'm not calling anyone, Dad, he said, his voice eerily calm. Not yet. Those 3 words, not yet, hit me harder than the heart attack itself. Because they meant this was planned. They meant he had a timeline. They meant my son, my only child, the boy I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, was actively choosing to let me suffer. I tried to reach for my new phone on the nightstand, but Danny moved faster than I could in my condition. He snatched it up and slipped it into his pocket like he was confiscating a toy from a misbehaving child. Why? I whispered. It was all I could manage, but it contained every question I had. Why are you doing this? Why aren't you helping me? Why do you look like you want this to happen? Danny sat down on the edge of my bed, and for a split second, I thought maybe he was coming to his senses. Maybe he would help me after all. But instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Do you know what this is, Dad? He asked, unfolding it slowly. I couldn't focus on the words. The pain was getting worse, radiating down both arms now, and I was starting to see spots dancing in front of my eyes. But I could make out enough to recognize my own letterhead, my own signature at the bottom of what looked like a legal document. It's your will, Danny continued conversationally, like we were discussing the weather instead of my impending death. The one you updated 6 months ago with that lawyer I recommended. Remember? I remembered. Danny had convinced me that my old will was outdated, that changes in tax law meant I needed to restructure everything to protect my assets. He'd brought me to his friend's office, a sharp young attorney who specialized in estate planning for wealthy clients. I trusted Danny's judgment. I'd signed where they told me to sign. What I love about this will, Danny said, still in that eerily calm voice, is how clean it is. Everything goes to me, your sole heir and beneficiary. No complications, no probate issues, no questions from the IRS. Just a simple transfer of assets from father to son. The pieces were falling into place now, even through the haze of pain and terror. You planned this, I managed to say. I planned for this, he corrected. There's a difference. I didn't cause your heart attack, Dad. Your genetics did that, combined with 68 years of cigarettes, beer, and bacon cheeseburgers. I just positioned myself to benefit from the inevitable. If you've ever felt the exact moment when your heart breaks, not metaphorically, but literally, when the muscle that's supposed to keep you alive starts failing, then you know that physical pain is nothing compared to emotional devastation. Watching my son, the person I loved more than anyone else in the world, explain why he was going to let me die was worse than any cardiac event could ever be. But Danny wasn't finished. He was just getting started. See, here's what's going to happen, he continued, folding the will and putting it back in his jacket. You're going to have your heart attack. I'm going to find you in the morning when I come to check on you. I'll be devastated, of course. Grief-stricken. The loving son who tried so hard to take care of his aging father but couldn't prevent the inevitable. He stood up and walked toward my bedroom door, and that's when the full horror of the situation hit me. He was leaving. He was actually going to walk out of that room and let me die alone. Danny, please, I begged, and I'm not ashamed to say I was crying now. I'm your father. I love you. I've always loved you. Whatever I did wrong, whatever you're angry about, we can fix it. But please don't do this. Don't let me die like this. He paused in the doorway and turned back to look at me. For just a moment, I saw something flicker across his face, a shadow of the boy he used to be, maybe, or just a fleeting moment of doubt. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. You didn't do anything wrong, Dad, he said, and his voice was almost gentle now. You were a good father. You loved me, you provided for me, you gave me every opportunity. But you also gave me something else. You gave me intelligence. You gave me ambition. You taught me to recognize opportunities and seize them when they present themselves. This isn't an opportunity, I whispered. This is murder. No, Danny replied, shaking his head. Murder requires action. This is just letting nature take its course. Your heart is failing because it's old and damaged. I'm simply choosing not to interfere with that natural process. The twisted logic of it was almost impressive in its cruelty. He'd found a way to justify letting his father die by framing it as non-interference rather than active harm. In his mind, he wasn't killing me, he was just failing to save me. And somehow, that distinction made it acceptable to him. Besides, he added, it's not like you're going to suffer forever. Heart attacks are usually pretty quick. You'll lose consciousness soon, and then it'll all be over. Peaceful, really, when you think about it. That's when I tried to get out of bed. Pain or no pain, dying heart or not, I was going to fight. I was going to get to a phone, get to a neighbor, get to help somehow. But the moment I tried to stand up, my legs gave out completely. I collapsed to the floor beside my bed, gasping, clutching at my chest, completely helpless. Danny watched me fall without moving to help. He just stood there, observing, like he was watching a science experiment reach its conclusion. I'll leave the door open, he said as I lay there struggling to breathe. That way, when they find you, it won't look like you were trapped or anything. Just an old man who had a heart attack in his bedroom and couldn't quite make it to the phone in time. But then, as he turned to leave, something changed his mind. Maybe it was the sound of a car driving by outside, or a neighbor's dog barking, or just some paranoid thought that crossed his mind. Whatever it was, he came back into the room, grabbed the door handle, and pulled it shut. I heard the click of the lock engaging, a sound that still haunts my nightmares. Actually, he called through the door. On second thought, this is better. More contained. Less variables to worry about. That's when the true horror of my situation became clear. I wasn't just having a heart attack. I was having a heart attack while locked in a room by the one person who was supposed to love me unconditionally. I was trapped, helpless, and completely at the mercy of someone who had decided I was worth more to him dead than alive. I crawled to the door on my hands and knees, each movement sending fresh waves of agony through my chest. When I reached it, I pounded on the wood with whatever strength I had left. "Danny!" I shouted, though my voice was barely above a whisper now. "Please! Please don't do this! I'll give you whatever you want. The money, the properties, everything. Just call for help." I heard his footsteps in the hallway outside, pacing back and forth like he was thinking it over. For a moment, hope flared in my chest. Maybe he would change his mind. Maybe there was still enough of the boy I'd raised left in him to save his father's life. But then the footsteps stopped, and I heard something that made my blood freeze. He was laughing. Not the warm, joyful laugh I remembered from his childhood, but a cold, bitter sound that barely seemed human. It was the laugh of someone who had crossed a line they could never uncross, someone who had discovered they were capable of cruelties they'd never imagined. "Dad," he called through the door. "You still don't get it. I don't want you to give me the money. I want you to leave it to me. There's a difference." And then his footsteps retreated down the hall, leaving me alone with my failing heart and the terrible understanding that my own son was going to let me die for an inheritance. But here's what Danny didn't know. Here's the first of many mistakes he made that night. I wasn't going to die quietly. I wasn't going to make this easy for him. Even if my heart was giving out, even if I was locked in that room, even if my own flesh and blood had betrayed me in the worst possible way, I was going to fight. Because sometimes, the will to live is stronger than the body that contains it. And sometimes, a father's love can survive even the deepest betrayal. What happened next would test both of those beliefs to their absolute limits. The minutes crawled by like hours as I lay on my bedroom floor, each heartbeat feeling like it might be my last. The pain had evolved from the sharp, crushing sensation in my chest to a more diffuse agony that seemed to radiate through every nerve in my body. But worse than the physical pain was the mental anguish of knowing that just outside my door, my son was going about his business, probably making himself a sandwich, or watching television, while his father died alone. I could hear him moving around the house. The old floorboards creaked under his feet as he walked from room to room, and occasionally I'd catch the sound of cabinets opening and closing, the refrigerator door, the television turning on. Normal sounds. Casual sounds. The sounds of someone who was completely comfortable with what he was doing. Around 4 a.m., about 45 minutes after he'd locked me in, I heard him on the phone. His voice was muffled by the walls and my own labored breathing, but I could make out enough to understand what he was doing. He was calling his office, leaving a voicemail for his secretary about needing to take a few days of bereavement leave. Family emergency, he said. His father wasn't doing well. The audacity of it, the sheer, calculated coldness of planning his alibi while I was still alive, still suffering, still hoping for rescue, gave me a burst of rage that actually made me feel stronger for a moment. Rage, I discovered, can be a powerful medicine when you're dying. It can give you energy when your body has nothing left to give. I managed to pull myself up to a sitting position against the door, and started thinking clearly for the first time since the pain had started. Danny thought he had this all figured out, thought he'd planned for every contingency. But there were things he didn't know about his old man, things I'd never had reason to tell him. First, he didn't know about the spare phone I kept hidden in my bedroom. It was an old prepaid cell phone that I'd bought years ago and forgotten about, tucked away in the back of my sock drawer as an emergency backup. The battery was probably dead after all this time, but if I could find the charger. Second, he didn't know that I'd been having doubts about him for months. Not about the heart attack, I could never have imagined anything this extreme, but about his sudden interest in my finances, his constant questions about my health, the way he'd been pushing me to update legal documents and change beneficiaries. Something had felt off about it all, and I'd started taking precautions. Third, and most importantly, he didn't know that the will he was counting on, the one he'd had his lawyer friend draw up, wasn't actually my final will. 2 weeks before that night, I'd quietly visited a different attorney and made some changes. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would cut Danny out entirely, but enough to ensure that if something happened to me under suspicious circumstances, there would be questions. Lots of questions. But none of that would matter if I died in this room tonight. Dead men can't reveal their secrets, and Danny would have months to cover his tracks before anyone started asking uncomfortable questions. I crawled across the floor to my dresser, pulling out drawers and feeling around in the darkness. My hands were shaking from the pain and the adrenaline, but I finally found what I was looking for, that old flip phone and its charger, buried under a pile of t-shirts I never wore anymore. The phone was indeed dead, but the charger cord was long enough to reach an outlet near my bed. I plugged it in and waited, praying that after all these years, the battery would still hold a charge. While I waited, I could hear Danny in the living room, apparently settling in for the night. The TV was on, some late-night talk show, from the sound of it. He was probably sitting in my recliner, my father's old chair that had been in our family for 30 years, watching comedy sketches while his father slowly died 20 feet away. The thought of it made me want to scream, but I had to stay quiet. If Danny heard me moving around, if he realized I was still conscious and potentially still fighting, he might come back to check on me. And I didn't want to find out what he'd do if he discovered I had access to a phone. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 15 minutes, a tiny red light appeared on the old phone's display. It was charging. The battery was accepting power. I might have a chance. But even as hope flickered to life in my chest, the pain was getting worse. My vision was starting to blur again, and I was having trouble catching my breath. Whatever was happening to my heart, it was progressing. Danny's timeline might be shorter than either of us had anticipated. I thought about Linda then, about my wife who'd been gone for over 20 years now. We used to joke about dying together, about going out holding hands like some romantic movie cliché. She'd made me promise that when my time came, I wouldn't go quietly. Fight for every extra day, she'd said during those final weeks when the cancer was winning. Fight for every extra hour. Because every moment of life is precious, even the painful ones. I'd kept that promise when she was dying, advocating for every treatment, every experimental drug, every last desperate attempt to buy her more time. And I was going to keep it now, even though the person I was fighting against was the son we'd raised together. The phone finally had enough charge to turn on. The display was cracked and dim, but it was functional. I could make calls. I could get help. But as I started to dial 911, I heard Danny's footsteps in the hallway again. He was coming back toward my room. I quickly turned off the phone and shoved it under my pillow, then lay back down on the floor in the same position I'd been in when he left. If he was coming to check on me, I needed to look like I was still dying helplessly, still completely at his mercy. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I could see the shadow of his feet in the crack of light underneath. He stood there for several minutes, and I realized he was listening. Listening for sounds of distress, or for the absence of sound that would indicate his plan had succeeded. I forced myself to breathe in the same labored, irregular pattern I'd been breathing when he left. I let out occasional small groans of pain. I made sure to sound like a man whose body was failing, even though the brief surge of hope had actually made me feel slightly stronger. "Dad?" he called softly through the door. I didn't answer immediately. I wanted him to think I was unconscious, or at least too weak to respond. "Dad, are you okay in there?" The question was so absurd, so perfectly calculated to sound caring while being completely meaningless, that I almost laughed. Of course I wasn't okay. He knew I wasn't okay. He was counting on me not being okay. "Danny," I finally whispered, making my voice as weak and desperate as possible. "Please help me." There was a long pause. Then, "Just try to rest, Dad. Try to stay calm. Everything's going to be okay." More lies. More manipulation. Even now, Even as he was actively letting me die, he was still pretending to care. Still maintaining the fiction that he was the loving son who just happened to be powerless to help. His footsteps retreated again, but this time they went toward the kitchen instead of back to the living room. I heard cabinets opening, the coffee maker starting up. He was settling in for a long wait, making himself comfortable while he monitored my dying. That's when I realized something that chilled me to the bone. Danny was enjoying this. This wasn't just about the money, wasn't just a cold business calculation. He was actually savoring the process, the power, the control he had over my life and death. He was relishing every moment of my suffering because it proved something to him about his own capabilities, his own ruthlessness. My son had become a monster, and I was his victim. But monsters, I've learned, often underestimate their prey. They become overconfident, sloppy, careless. They assume that fear and pain will make their victims compliant and predictable. Danny had no idea that his dying father was about to become the most dangerous enemy he'd ever faced. I waited until I heard the coffee maker finish brewing, until I heard him pour a cup and add sugar. He always took 2 spoonfuls, even as a kid, until I heard him settle back into the living room with the TV volume turned up slightly higher than before. Then I turned the phone back on, covered myself with a blanket to muffle any sounds, and dialed 911. The call connected on the second ring. 911, what's your emergency? I cupped my hand around the phone's mouthpiece and whispered as quietly as I could while still being audible. This is Frank Castellano at 847 Maple Street. I'm having a heart attack, and I'm locked in my bedroom. My son locked me in here and won't let me get help. There was a brief pause. Sir, I need you to speak up. Did you say you're locked in a room? Yes, I whispered urgently. Please, you have to send help. I think I'm dying, and my son, he's not going to let anyone help me. He wants me to die. Sir, we're sending an ambulance and police to your location right now. Can you tell me more about your condition? Are you conscious and breathing? Barely. Chest pain, left arm numb, hard to breathe. And please. I had to pause as another wave of pain washed over me. Please tell the police, this isn't an accident. This is intentional. My son is trying to kill me. Officers are 3 minutes away, sir. Stay on the line with me. What's your son's name? Danny. Daniel Castellano. He's in the living room. He thinks I'm dying quietly in here, but I found a phone. He doesn't know I called. The officers will handle this, sir. Just concentrate on staying conscious. Can you try to move away from the door in case they need to break it down? I managed to crawl back toward my bed, dragging the phone with me. Every movement sent fresh spikes of pain through my chest, but the adrenaline and the hope of rescue were keeping me functional. Sir, are you still with me? Still here, I whispered. I need to ask, does your son have any weapons in the house that you know of? The question made my blood run cold. I'd never thought about that. What would Danny do when the police arrived? How far was he willing to go to protect his plan? I don't know, I admitted. I don't think so, but I don't know anything anymore. I thought I knew my son, but it's okay, sir. The officers are trained to handle these situations. I can hear sirens now. Are those the first responders? I listened carefully. In the distance, barely audible over the sound of the TV, I could hear sirens approaching. Help was coming. After hours of hopelessness, after believing I was going to die alone and betrayed, help was actually coming. But Danny could hear those sirens too. I heard his coffee cup hit the floor in the living room, heard him curse loudly, heard his footsteps running toward the front of the house. He was looking out the windows, trying to figure out what was happening. Then I heard something that made my heart race even faster than the cardiac event already had. I heard Danny running back down the hall toward my room. He knew. Somehow, he'd figured out that I'd called for help, and he was coming back to finish what he'd started. The doorknob rattled as he tried to unlock it, but something was wrong. The key wasn't working, or he was having trouble with it in his panic. I could hear him swearing, Could hear the desperation creeping into his voice as the sirens got closer. "Dad!" he shouted through the door. "Dad, what did you do? What did you do?" I didn't answer. I just held that phone close to my ear and listened to the 911 operator telling me that help was almost there, that everything was going to be okay, that I just needed to hold on for a few more minutes. But a few more minutes might be too long. Because now I could hear Danny doing something to the door, something more aggressive than just trying to unlock it. He was slamming his shoulder against it, trying to break it down. If he got into this room before the police got into the house, I was a dead man. And this time, it wouldn't look like natural causes. The sirens were right outside now, and I could see red and blue lights flashing through my bedroom window. But Danny was still trying to break down the door, and with each impact, I could hear the wood starting to splinter. This was going to come down to seconds. Seconds that would determine whether I lived to see justice served, or whether my son would succeed in killing me after all. The sound of splintering wood mixed with the wail of sirens outside created a symphony of terror and hope that I'll never forget. Danny was throwing his full weight against my bedroom door now, and I could see the frame starting to give way. Each impact sent a small shower of paint chips and wood splinters onto the carpet, and the metal hinges were beginning to bend under the assault. "Sir, the officers are at your front door," the 911 operator said through my hidden phone. "Can you hear them?" I could hear them. The commanding voice of authority cutting through the chaos. "Police! Open the door now!" But Danny didn't stop. If anything, he became more frantic, more desperate. The door was starting to buckle inward, and I realized with growing horror that he might actually break through before the police could get inside the house. "They're trying to get in," I whispered to the operator. "But my son, he's trying to break down my door. I think he's going to try to kill me before they can stop him." "Stay away from the door, sir. Get to the furthest corner of the room if you can." I dragged myself toward my bathroom, each movement an agony that made spots dance in front of my eyes. The heart attack symptoms weren't getting better. If anything, the stress of the situation was making them worse. But I had to move. I had to put as much distance as possible between myself and Danny's increasingly violent attempts to reach me. That's when I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the crash of my front door being kicked in. "Police! Nobody move!" Danny's assault on my bedroom door stopped immediately. I could hear his heavy breathing in the hallway, could practically feel his panic through the walls. For a moment, there was complete silence except for the sound of heavy boots moving through my house. "Sir, put your hands where we can see them!" The officer's voice was closer now, probably in my living room. I live here," Danny said, and I was amazed at how quickly he shifted into his innocent act. His voice was suddenly shaky, confused, like he was just a concerned son who'd been startled by a home invasion. "This is my father's house. He was having chest pains, and I was trying to help him. Step back from that door, sir. Hands visible at all times. Officer, I don't understand what's happening here. My father is sick. He's in that room, and I think he might be having a heart attack. I was just trying to get to him to help." The lies came so smoothly, so convincingly, that for a moment I wondered if the police would believe him. Danny had always been charming when he needed to be, persuasive in a way that made people want to trust him. And his story, the concerned son trying to help his ailing father, was exactly the kind of narrative that would make sense to outsiders. But the 911 operator was still on the line with me, and she could hear everything that was happening. "Sir, are you still there?" she asked. "The officers need to know you're okay." "I'm here," I whispered. Tell them I'm locked in the bedroom, and I have the key. My son locked me in here and took my phone." "This isn't what he's telling them." I could hear the operator relaying this information over police radio, could hear the shift in tone from the officers when they received this new information. "Sir, we need you to unlock this door right now," one of the officers commanded. I don't have the key," Danny lied. "I think it might be inside with him." "Dad?" Dad, can you unlock the door? He's lying! I called out, loud enough for the officers to hear. He has the key! He locked me in here! Check his pockets! The silence that followed was deafening. I could imagine Danny's face in that moment, the mask slipping, the careful facade crumbling as he realized his lies weren't going to work. Sir, I need you to place your hands on the wall and spread your legs, the officer said, his voice now cold and professional. You're being detained pending investigation. This is insane, Danny protested, but his voice had lost that convincing tone. Now he just sounded desperate. You can't seriously think that I would hurt my own father. I love him. I'm trying to help him. The key, sir. Where is it? There was a long pause. Then I heard the sound of metal hitting the floor, the key being dropped or thrown down in frustration. There, Danny said bitterly. But you're making a mistake. When you get in there and see that he's just a sick old man having a medical emergency, you're going to realize how wrong you are about all of this. I heard footsteps approaching my door, heard the key being inserted into the lock. The door swung open, and I saw a police officer's face peering into my room, a young woman with kind eyes and a concerned expression. Sir, I'm Officer Martinez, she said, immediately moving to where I was slumped against the bathroom doorway. EMTs are right behind me. How are you feeling? Like I'm dying, I managed to say, and it wasn't entirely an exaggeration. The stress of the last few hours had taken a serious toll on my already compromised cardiovascular system. Sir, I need to ask, did your son prevent you from getting medical attention? He locked me in this room, I said, each word an effort. He took my phone. He said he was going to let me die so he could inherit my money. He planned this. Officer Martinez's expression hardened as she spoke into her radio. We need those EMTs up here now, and I need backup officers to secure the scene. We're looking at possible attempted murder. I could hear Danny in the living room, still protesting his innocence, still trying to convince the other officers that this was all a misunderstanding. But his voice was getting higher, more frantic, less convincing with every word. The EMTs arrived within minutes, 2 paramedics who immediately began assessing my condition with professional efficiency. Blood pressure cuff, heart monitor, Fräulein oxygen mask. The cavalry had arrived, and for the first time in hours, I felt like I might actually survive this night. Sir, you're definitely having cardiac events, one of the EMTs told me as he read the portable EKG machine. We need to get you to the hospital immediately. As they prepared me for transport, I could hear the conversation happening in my living room becoming more heated. Danny was demanding to know why he was being treated like a criminal, insisting that he had done nothing wrong. The officers were asking pointed questions about why the door was locked, why he had taken my phone, why he hadn't called for medical help when his father was clearly in distress. If you were trying to help him, I heard one officer ask, why didn't you call 911? I was about to, Danny replied, but the hesitation in his voice made it clear that even he knew how weak that sounded. Sir, your father says you told him you weren't going to call anyone. He says you said not yet. Can you explain that? The silence stretched so long that I wondered if Danny was going to refuse to answer. But finally I heard his voice, smaller now, deflated. You don't understand the situation. My father, he's been having problems. Memory issues, confusion. Sometimes he says things that aren't true. It was his last desperate attempt to discredit me, to make it seem like I was an unreliable witness to my own attempted murder. But the officers had already seen too much, heard too much, to buy that explanation. As the EMTs wheeled me out of my bedroom on a gurney, I caught sight of Danny in the living room. He was sitting in my recliner, the same chair he'd been relaxing in while waiting for me to die, but now he was flanked by 2 police officers, and his hands were cuffed behind his back. Our eyes met for just a moment as they wheeled me past, and what I saw there wasn't remorse or shame or even anger. It was calculation. Even now, even caught red-handed, he was already working on his next move, his next lie, his next manipulation. Dad, he called out as I passed, his voice taking on that familiar loving tone that had fooled me for so many months. "Dad, please tell them this is all a misunderstanding. Tell them I was trying to help you." I looked right at him, this stranger wearing my son's face, and said the words that I knew would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Officer Martinez, make sure you check his phone. He was monitoring my heart rate through an app. He knew exactly when this was going to happen, and he was ready for it." Danny's face went pale, and I saw something I'd never seen there before, genuine fear. Because he knew that his phone would contain evidence of premeditation, proof that this hadn't been a spontaneous decision or a moment of panic. His own technology, his own surveillance system, was going to be the evidence that sent him to prison. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I could hear him shouting behind us, his voice no longer controlled or calculated. "Dad! Dad, you don't understand. I need that money. I owe people. Bad people. You don't know what they'll do to me." And there it was, the truth finally coming out. This hadn't just been about inheritance or greed. Danny was in trouble, the kind of trouble that makes people desperate enough to kill their own fathers. But that would be a revelation for another day. Right now, I just needed to survive long enough to see justice served. The ambulance doors closed, cutting off the sound of Danny's increasingly frantic pleas, and for the first time in hours, I allowed myself to close my eyes and rest. I was alive. Help had arrived. The nightmare was over. Or so I thought. But as I would soon learn, surviving the heart attack and Danny's betrayal was only the beginning of a much longer, more complex story. Because when you've been betrayed by someone you love, when you've stared death in the face and lived to tell about it, it changes something fundamental inside you. It makes you realize that forgiveness isn't always possible. And sometimes, survival isn't enough. Sometimes, you want revenge. The cardiac care unit at St. Mary's Hospital became my world for the next 8 days. Triple bypass surgery, they said. 3 major arteries had been blocked, and if I'd arrived even an hour later, I probably wouldn't have made it. The irony wasn't lost on me. Danny's plan had been almost perfect in its timing. He'd calculated everything down to the minute, except for one crucial factor: his father's stubborn refusal to die quietly. During those first few days, as I drifted in and out of consciousness on a cocktail of pain medications and heart drugs, I had visitors. Lots of them. Police detectives, district attorneys, FBI agents. Apparently, when you accuse your own son of attempted murder, it tends to generate a lot of official interest. Detective Sarah Chen was the lead investigator, a sharp woman in her 40s who'd seen enough family violence to know that blood relations didn't guarantee love or loyalty. She sat beside my hospital bed on day 3, when I was finally alert enough to give a coherent statement, and walked me through everything that had happened that night. "Mr. Castellano," she said, "I need you to understand the seriousness of what you're alleging. You're saying that your son deliberately tried to kill you for inheritance money. That's not just attempted murder, that's premeditated attempted murder with financial motivation. If we can prove this, we're looking at 25 to life." "I understand," I told her, though my voice was still weak from the breathing tube they'd removed the day before. "And I'm telling you that every word of it is true. My son planned my death and tried to execute that plan." She nodded and pulled out a tablet computer. "We've been investigating Daniel's finances, and what we've found is troubling. Your son is in serious debt. Not just credit card debt or student loans, we're talking about gambling debts to some very dangerous people." The tablet screen showed bank statements, credit reports, and what looked like loan documents. Danny's financial life was a disaster zone of maxed-out credit cards, unpaid bills, and increasingly desperate borrowing from increasingly questionable sources. "How much?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Close to $800,000, Detective Chen replied. "And based on the communications we found on his phone, the one you suggested we examine, some of these creditors were getting impatient. Very impatient." She swiped to another screen, showing text messages that made my blood run cold. Threats of violence. Photos of people who'd failed to pay their debts. messages making it clear that Danny's time was running out. One of these messages, sent just 2 days before your heart attack, told your son that he had 1 week to come up with at least $500,000 or face permanent consequences. Another message included a photo of your house, Mr. Castellano. They knew where he lived, and they knew where you lived. The pieces were falling into place now, painting a picture of desperation that explained everything. Danny hadn't just been greedy, he'd been terrified. Scared enough to kill his own father to save his own skin. There's more, Detective Chen continued. The app he installed on your phone, the one he claimed was for medical monitoring, it was actually recording everything. Your location, your vital signs, your sleep patterns, even your conversations. He'd been tracking your health data for months, waiting for signs that a cardiac event was imminent. She showed me charts and graphs that looked like something from a medical textbook. My heart rate patterns, blood pressure fluctuations, sleep disruptions, all meticulously recorded and analyzed. Danny had been studying my body like a scientist studying a lab rat, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But here's the thing that really sealed it for us, she said, swiping to a final screen. We found a search history on his computer going back 6 months. Searches about heart attack symptoms, about how long people typically survive without medical intervention, about inheritance law and estate probate procedures. And this one. She pointed to an entry that made my stomach turn. How to make a heart attack look natural. Jesus, I whispered. Your son had been planning this for a long time, Mr. Castellano. This wasn't a moment of desperation or panic. This was a calculated, premeditated attempt to murder you for financial gain. I stared at the evidence spread out on that tablet screen, the digital footprints of my son's betrayal laid bare in charts and messages and search histories. It was one thing to experience the betrayal firsthand, to feel the knife twist in your back from someone you loved. It was another thing entirely to see the methodical, calculating nature of that betrayal documented in black and white. What happens now? I asked. Daniel is being held without bail on charges of attempted murder, elder abuse, and conspiracy. The DA is confident we have enough evidence for conviction, especially with your testimony and all this digital evidence. But Mr. Castellano, there's something else you need to know. Her expression grew even more serious, which I wouldn't have thought possible. This isn't the first time your son has been involved in something like this. We've been in contact with police departments in 3 other states, and there's a pattern. In each case, Daniel befriended elderly individuals, sometimes through his work, sometimes through social connections, and then those individuals died under suspicious circumstances, leaving him as a beneficiary in their wills. The room seemed to tilt around me. Are you saying my son is a serial killer? We're saying he's a person of interest in several suspicious deaths, and now that we know his methods and motivations, we're reopening those investigations. Mr. Castellano, your survival may have saved not just your own life, but the lives of future victims. If you've ever discovered that someone you raised, someone you loved unconditionally, is capable of evil beyond your comprehension, then you understand what I felt in that moment. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was horror. It was the realization that I'd failed not just as a father, but as a human being. I'd brought a monster into the world and somehow missed all the warning signs. Over the next few days, as I slowly recovered from my surgery, Detective Chin brought me updates on the investigation. They'd found evidence linking Danny to the death of an elderly woman in Florida who'd left him $50,000 after knowing him for only 3 months. They'd found suspicious circumstances surrounding the death of a wealthy widow in Arizona whose will had been changed just weeks before her fatal accident. They'd found a pattern of manipulation, exploitation, and murder that stretched back at least 5 years. My son wasn't just a greedy opportunist. He was a predator who specialized in targeting vulnerable elderly people, gaining their trust, and then killing them for their money. And I'd been his latest target, the biggest score of his criminal career. But I'd also been his biggest mistake. Because unlike his previous victims, I'd survived. And unlike his previous victims, I wasn't going to let him get away with it. The trial was set for 8 months later, giving me time to recover physically and emotionally from the ordeal. But recovery, I discovered, is a relative term. My heart healed, the bypass surgery had been successful, and my cardiologist was optimistic about my long-term prognosis. My body grew strong again through months of physical therapy and careful rehabilitation. My soul, however, remained broken. How do you heal from the knowledge that your own child tried to murder you? How do you process the fact that the person you loved most in the world saw you as nothing more than an obstacle to overcome, a problem to solve, a resource to exploit? The answer, I learned, is that you don't heal from something like that. You adapt to it. You learn to live with the knowledge that love can be one-sided, that trust can be misplaced, that family bonds can be severed by greed and desperation. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you learn that survival can be its own form of power. During those months of recovery, I had a lot of time to think. A lot of time to plan. A lot of time to decide what kind of man I wanted to be in whatever years I had left. The old Frank Castellano, the trusting father, the forgiving parent, the man who believed that love could conquer all, had died in that locked bedroom. The man who'd survived was harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Because I'd learned something important that night. When someone tries to kill you, especially someone who's supposed to love you, it changes the fundamental rules of engagement. Forgiveness becomes impossible. Mercy becomes weakness. And justice becomes a personal responsibility. Danny's trial would determine his legal fate. But I was already planning something far more comprehensive, something that would ensure he paid not just for what he'd done to me, but for every life he'd destroyed, every family he'd shattered, every innocent person who trusted him and died for it. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But they never tell you how satisfying it can be to plan the meal while your enemy thinks they've already won. Danny's biggest mistake wasn't trying to kill me. It was failing to finish the job. Because a man who survived his own murder has nothing left to lose and everything left to gain. And that, as my son would soon discover, makes him the most dangerous kind of enemy you can have. The trial was still months away, but my revenge had already begun. The courthouse in downtown Syracuse was an imposing brick building that had seen a century of human drama played out in its halls. As I walked up those stone steps on the first day of Danny's trial, leaning heavily on the walking cane I needed since my heart surgery, I couldn't help but think about all the families who'd been torn apart within these walls. All the betrayals and crimes and broken promises that had been dissected by lawyers and judged by juries. But I doubt many of those cases had involved a son trying to murder his father for inheritance money. Even in a system that had seen every form of human depravity, our story was unusual enough to attract significant media attention. Danny looked different when they brought him into the courtroom. 8 months in county jail had changed him, made him thinner, paler, more hollow-eyed. The expensive suits and confident demeanor were gone, replaced by an orange jumpsuit and the hunched posture of a man who'd finally been caught. When our eyes met across that courtroom, I saw something I'd never seen in my son's face before: genuine fear. Not the calculated concern about getting caught that he'd shown that night, but raw, primal terror about what was going to happen to him. Good. He should be afraid. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Maria Santos, a woman with a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when it came to crimes against the elderly. She'd made her career prosecuting elder abuse cases, and Danny's situation, a son trying to murder his father for money, was exactly the kind of case that made her blood boil. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began in her opening statement, "this is not a complicated case. It's not about misunderstandings or family disputes or medical emergencies. This is about a man who made a cold, calculated decision to murder his own father for money. And the only reason Frank Castellano is alive today to testify before you is because his son underestimated his father's will to survive." Danny's defense attorney, a public defender named James Morrison who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, tried to paint a different picture. His strategy was to portray Danny as a devoted son who'd made some mistakes but would never intentionally harm his father. "My client is not a monster," Morrison argued. "He's a young man who got in over his head with debt and made some poor decisions. But attempting to murder his father? Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case of an elderly man who was confused and in pain, misinterpreting his son's actions during a medical emergency. It was a weak defense, and Morrison knew it. The evidence against Danny was overwhelming, and trying to paint me as a confused old man wasn't going to work when I was sitting right there in the courtroom, sharp as ever and ready to testify. The prosecution's case unfolded over 6 days, and each piece of evidence was more damning than the last. They presented the digital surveillance data that showed Danny had been monitoring my health for months. They showed the jury his search history, all those queries about heart attacks and inheritance law and making deaths look natural. They played recordings of his phone calls where he discussed his debt problems and his desperation for money. But the most devastating evidence came from Danny's own phone, specifically, the text messages he'd been exchanging with his creditors in the days leading up to my heart attack. "Pay up or your old man pays instead," read one message from a loan shark. "We know where he lives." Danny's response: "Give me 1 week. I'll have the money." Another message sent just hours before my heart attack began: "Tick-tock, Danny boy. Time's almost up." His response: "It's handled. Check the news in a few days." When D.A. Santos read that last message to the jury, I saw several of them physically recoil. Because that wasn't just evidence of intent, that was evidence of anticipation. Danny had been looking forward to my death, planning to use it as proof to his creditors that he'd solved his money problems. My testimony came on day 4 of the trial. Walking to that witness stand was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, not because I was physically weak, but because I had to look at my son while recounting the night he tried to kill me. "Mr. Castellano," D.A. Santos began, "please tell the jury what happened on the night of March 15th. I told them everything. The chest pain, calling for help, Danny's cold response, being locked in my room, the phone call to 911. I described the look in my son's eyes when he explained why he wasn't going to help me, the casual way he discussed my impending death, the calculated cruelty of his entire approach." "At any point," D.A. Santos asked, "did your son show any concern for your welfare?" "No," I replied, looking directly at Danny as I spoke. "He showed concern for his inheritance, concern for his timeline, concern for making sure my death looked natural. But concern for me as a human being, as his father? None whatsoever." The defense attorney's cross-examination was painful in a different way. Morrison tried to suggest that I'd been confused, that my memory was unreliable, that the stress of a heart attack had distorted my perception of events. "Mr. Castellano, isn't it true that you were in extreme pain during this alleged conversation with your son?" "I was in pain, yes. But I wasn't hallucinating. I know what my son said to me that night. But couldn't you have misunderstood his intentions? Couldn't he have been trying to help you in some way that you didn't recognize?" "Mr. Morrison," I said, feeling my anger rising, "there's no helpful interpretation of locking a man having a heart attack in his bedroom and taking away his phone. There's no misunderstanding what it means when someone tells you they're going to let you die for inheritance money. My son tried to murder me. Period." Morrison tried a few more angles, but he was fighting a losing battle. The evidence was too clear, too comprehensive, too damning to explain away. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when they called Danny himself to testify. Against his attorney's advice, he'd insisted on taking the stand, convinced that his charm and intelligence could somehow talk his way out of the situation. It was a mistake that sealed his fate. "Mr. Castellano," D.A. Santos began her cross-examination, "you've heard your father's testimony about the night of March 15th. Do you dispute any of the basic facts? That you were in the house, that he was having a heart attack, that you locked him in his room?" Danny's response was classic manipulation. "I don't dispute that those things happened, but the context is completely different from what my father has described. Please explain the context that would justify locking a man having a heart attack in his bedroom." I was trying to keep him calm. He was panicking, and I thought if he stayed in a quiet, familiar environment, while I figured out what to do, it would be better for him. "And taking his phone?" I took it because he was trying to call 911, and I wanted to make sure I understood the situation before involving emergency services. Sometimes my father gets confused, and I didn't want to waste paramedics' time on a false alarm. It was a lie so transparent, so obviously crafted after the fact, that I saw several jurors shake their heads in disbelief. Mr. Castellano, B.A. Santos continued, if you were concerned about your father's health, why didn't you call 911 yourself? I was assessing the situation. For how long? Your father was locked in that room for over 3 hours. Time moves differently in crisis situations. I thought it had been much less time than that. And during this time when you were assessing the situation, what exactly were you doing? Danny hesitated, realizing he'd painted himself into a corner. I was monitoring his condition. Monitoring his condition through a locked door? I could hear him. I was listening to make sure he was okay. Mr. Castellano, if your father was okay, why was he begging you for help? Why was he pleading with you to call an ambulance? He was scared. People say things when they're scared that don't necessarily reflect reality. D.A. Santos pulled out a transcript of the 911 call I'd made from my hidden phone. Mr. Castellano, I'm going to read you something your father said to the 911 operator that night. Quote, my son locked me in here and won't let me get help. He wants me to die. End quote. How do you explain that? My father was in pain and confused. He didn't understand what I was trying to do. And what were you trying to do? Help him. By locking him in a room, taking his phone, and ignoring his pleas for medical assistance? Yes. I thought that was the best approach at the time. It was painful to watch, even knowing what Danny had done to me. This was still my son, still the boy I'd raised, and seeing him destroy himself on the witness stand with increasingly desperate lies was almost heartbreaking. Almost. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with their verdict, the foreman stood and delivered the words I'd been waiting 8 months to hear. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of elder abuse, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy, we find the defendant guilty. Danny's face crumpled when he heard the verdict. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, he looked like the frightened child he'd once been instead of the calculating killer he'd become. But it was too late for sympathy now. Too late for forgiveness. Too late for second chances. The judge sentenced him to 25 years to life in state prison. With good behavior, he might be eligible for parole when he was 55 years old. By the time he got out, I'd be long gone, and his inheritance, the money he'd been willing to kill for, would have gone to the charities I'd designated in my new will. Justice had been served. The system had worked. My son was going to pay for his crimes. But as I watched them lead Danny away in shackles, I realized that the legal victory was just the beginning. Because there were still questions that needed answers, still debts that needed to be paid, still people who deserved justice for what my son had done to them. The trial was over, but my work was just beginning. The weeks following Danny's conviction should have brought me peace. Justice had been served, my would-be killer was behind bars, and I was alive to see it all happen. But instead of closure, I found myself consumed by a different kind of obsession, uncovering the full extent of my son's crimes. Detective Chin had mentioned other suspicious deaths, other elderly victims who'd trusted Danny and paid for it with their lives. But the more I learned about those cases, the more I realized that the justice system was failing those victims. Some of the deaths had been ruled accidental. Others were closed cases with insufficient evidence. Danny was going to prison for trying to kill me, but he wasn't going to pay for the people he'd actually succeeded in murdering. That ate at me like acid in my gut. I started with Margaret Hoffman, a 73-year-old widow from Phoenix who'd died 6 months before Danny's attack on me. According to the police reports that Detective Chen had shared, Margaret had met Danny at a financial planning seminar he'd been conducting for an investment firm. She'd been recently widowed, overwhelmed by managing her husband's estate, and vulnerable to a charming young man who promised to help her navigate the complex world of inheritance and investments. Danny had spent 3 months gaining her trust, visiting her twice a week, helping her organize her finances, even taking her to doctor's appointments when she complained about feeling lonely and isolated. He'd convinced her to update her will, suggesting she leave a substantial portion of her estate to someone who'd really appreciate it and put it to good use. Namely, him. Margaret had died in what police ruled an accidental fall down the stairs in her home. But now that I knew Danny's methods, the circumstances looked much more sinister. Margaret had been found at the bottom of her basement stairs with injuries consistent with a fall, but there were inconsistencies that made more sense when viewed through the lens of murder rather than accident. She'd been found wearing shoes that didn't belong to her, expensive running shoes that were 2 sizes too large and still had tags on them. The basement light was burned out, making the stairs treacherous to navigate. And most tellingly, she'd been found with her cell phone in her hand, like she'd been trying to call for help. The medical examiner had ruled it an accidental death, and the case had been closed within a week. But I could see what had really happened. Danny had lured Margaret to the basement under some pretext, caused her to fall or pushed her down those stairs, then staged the scene to look like an accident. The oversized shoes were meant to explain why she'd lost her footing. The burnout light bulb was meant to explain why she couldn't see where she was going. It was a crude murder compared to what he'd tried with me, but it had worked. Margaret was dead, Danny inherited $80,000, and nobody asked too many questions about a lonely old woman who'd had an accident in her own home. But Margaret wasn't the only one. The more I dug, the more victims I found. There was Robert Chin, no relation to Detective Chin, in Tampa, a retired engineer who'd left Danny $45,000 after knowing him for only 2 months. Robert had died of what appeared to be a heart attack, but he'd been found in his car in a parking lot, and the autopsy revealed an unusual combination of medications in his system, medications that hadn't been prescribed to him, but were readily available to someone working in financial services who had access to clients' medical information. There was Dorothy Walsh in Albuquerque, an 80-year-old former teacher who'd left Danny her entire estate, over $200,000, after he'd helped her reorganize her finances for tax purposes. Dorothy had died in what police called a home invasion gone wrong, but the only thing missing from her house was a single piece of jewelry, a ring that had been specifically mentioned in her old will as going to her niece, but had been removed from the updated will that left everything to Danny. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Danny would target elderly people who were isolated, vulnerable, and wealthy. He'd spend weeks or months gaining their trust, positioning himself as their financial advisor or simply as a caring young friend. He'd convince them to update their wills in his favor. And then, once the legal documents were in place, he'd kill them in ways that looked accidental or natural. It was a sophisticated operation that had been going on for years, and I was the first intended victim who'd survived to expose it. But here's the thing that really made my blood boil. Even with all this evidence, even with the clear pattern of behavior, most of these cases couldn't be reopened. Statute of limitations, lack of physical evidence, jurisdictional issues. There were a dozen legal reasons why Danny would never face justice for most of his crimes. That's when I made a decision that would have seemed impossible to the old Frank Castellano, the trusting father who believed in forgiveness and second chances. I decided that if the legal system couldn't deliver justice for Danny's other victims, then I would have to find another way. I started by reaching out to the families of his victims. It wasn't easy, many of them had moved on, and others didn't want to reopen old wounds by discussing their loved one's death with a stranger. But some were willing to listen, especially when I explained who I was and what my son had done to me. Margaret Hoffman's daughter, Susan, was the first person I contacted. She lived in Denver now, had moved there after settling her mother's estate, and when I called her, she broke down crying before I'd even finished explaining why I was reaching out. "I always knew something was wrong," she told me through her tears. "My mother was terrified of going down to the basement. She had arthritis in her knees, and she never, ever went down there alone. But the police said it was just an accident, that old people fall sometimes, and I didn't know how to argue with them. Susan had done her own investigation after her mother's death, hiring a private investigator who'd found some disturbing information about Danny's background. But without concrete evidence of murder, and with the case officially closed, there was nothing she could do with that information. "I've been carrying this guilt for months," she said. "Guilt that I didn't protect my mother, guilt that I let some stranger convince her to change her will, guilt that I didn't push harder when things didn't add up. But now at least I know I wasn't crazy. Now I know my instincts were right." I had similar conversations with Robert Chen's brother in Miami, with Dorothy Walsh's niece in Colorado, with the adult children of 3 other elderly victims whose deaths had all followed the same pattern. Danny had killed their loved ones, stolen their inheritances, and walked away without consequences. Until now. "What can we do?" Susan asked me during our third phone conversation. "The police won't reopen the case. The prosecutors say there's not enough evidence. Danny's already in prison for what he did to you, so it's not like we can get him additional time. What's left?" What was left, I told her, was making sure that Danny's victims weren't forgotten. What was left was ensuring that he paid a different kind of price for what he'd done. What was left was justice that went beyond the legal system. I'd been thinking about this for weeks, and I'd come up with a plan that was both simple and devastating. Danny was going to spend the next 25 years in prison, assuming he survived that long. But prison, I'd learned through my research, has its own form of justice, especially for inmates whose crimes involve hurting elderly people. The thing about career criminals is that many of them have mothers, grandmothers, elderly relatives they care about. And they don't take kindly to people who prey on the elderly. In prison hierarchy, child molesters are at the bottom, but elder abusers aren't far above them. Danny's fellow inmates were going to learn exactly what he'd done, and exactly how many elderly victims he'd killed. They were going to learn that he targeted vulnerable old people, gained their trust, and then murdered them for money. And they were going to learn these details in ways that would make Danny's life in prison as miserable and dangerous as possible. But that was just the beginning. I'd also been doing research into Danny's financial situation, both before and after his crimes. The money he'd inherited from his victims had mostly gone to pay off his gambling debts, but there were still some assets left, a small investment account, some personal property, a few $1,000s in various bank accounts. All of that was going to be seized through civil lawsuits that I was helping the victims' families file. We couldn't get Danny prosecuted for most of his murders, but we could take every penny he had left through wrongful death suits. The burden of proof in civil court is much lower than in criminal court. We didn't need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Danny had killed these people, just that it was more likely than not. And with the evidence we'd gathered, along with Danny's conviction for attempting to murder me, those civil suits were almost guaranteed to succeed. But even that wasn't enough. Not for what he'd done. Not for the lives he'd destroyed, the families he'd torn apart, the elderly people who died alone and afraid because they trusted the wrong person. I wanted Danny to know that his victims hadn't been forgotten. I wanted him to understand that his crimes had consequences that would follow him for the rest of his life. I wanted him to pay not just legally and financially, but emotionally and psychologically. So I started writing letters. Not to Danny, I had no interest in communicating with him directly. But to other people. To his fellow inmates, through intermediaries. To guards who might be sympathetic to the plight of elderly victims. To other prisoners' families who might share information that would make its way back to Danny. In these letters, I told Margaret's story. I described how she'd been a widow trying to manage her late husband's estate, how Danny had spent months gaining her trust, how he'd convinced her to change her will, and how he'd ultimately murdered her by pushing her down her basement stairs. I included photos of Margaret, a smiling elderly woman who looked forward to spending her golden years traveling and spoiling her grandchildren. I told Robert's story, describing how Danny had poisoned him with medication that caused a fatal heart attack, leaving him to die alone in a parking lot like a discarded piece of trash. I told Dorothy's story, explaining how Danny had staged a home invasion to cover up his murder of an 80-year-old retired teacher who'd spent her career educating children and had died because she trusted the wrong person. I made sure these stories reached the right people in the prison where Danny was being held. And I made sure they included enough detail that anyone who heard them would understand exactly what kind of monster they were sharing space with. Prison justice isn't always swift, but it's usually thorough. And inmates who prey on vulnerable elderly people don't tend to have an easy time behind bars. Within 2 months of my letter-writing campaign, I started hearing reports through my contacts in the system. Danny had been moved to protective custody after several incidents with other inmates. He'd been attacked in the shower. His cell had been ransacked multiple times. He'd been forced to request solitary confinement for his own protection. Prison had become exactly what I'd hoped it would be for him, a living hell where he was reminded daily of what he'd done and who he'd hurt. But I wasn't finished. Because there was one more aspect of Danny's punishment that needed to be addressed: the public shame that should come with committing such heinous crimes. I started reaching out to reporters, sharing the full story of Danny's crimes and the pattern of elder abuse that had gone unpunished for years. I made sure that whenever someone searched for Daniel Castellano online, they'd find articles about his crimes, photos of his victims, and details about the trust he'd betrayed and the lives he'd destroyed. I wanted his name to become synonymous with the worst kind of betrayal. I wanted anyone who might encounter him in the future, whether that was decades from now when he got out of prison, or people who knew him before his crimes, to understand exactly what he was capable of. The old Frank Castellano would have been horrified by what I was doing. He would have believed in redemption, in the possibility that even someone like Danny could change, could find remorse, could somehow make amends for his crimes. But that Frank had died in a locked bedroom while his son waited for him to suffocate on his own fear and pain. The man who'd survived was harder, colder, and infinitely more committed to the idea that some actions have permanent consequences. Danny had chosen to become a predator. He'd chosen to target the most vulnerable members of society. He'd chosen to betray the trust of people who saw him as a son, a friend, a helper. Now he was going to live with the consequences of those choices for the rest of his life. And every day that he woke up in that prison cell, every time he looked over his shoulder in fear, every moment he spent wondering if this would be the day that prison justice finally caught up with him completely, he'd have a chance to think about Margaret and Robert and Dorothy and all the other innocent people whose lives he'd stolen for money. That, I decided, was a form of justice that the legal system couldn't provide but that a father's love turned to fury absolutely could. The wheels of official justice had turned slowly, but they'd turned. Now it was time for a different kind of justice to take its course. And unlike the legal system, this kind of justice wouldn't be bound by statutes of limitations or burdens of proof or jurisdictional technicalities. This kind of justice would last for as long as Danny drew breath. 2 years after Danny's conviction, I received a call that changed everything. It was Detective Chin, and her voice carried the weight of news that I'd been both expecting and dreading. "Mr. Castellano," she said, "I wanted to let you know before you heard it somewhere else. Your son was found dead in his cell this morning." The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Dead. Danny was dead. The son I'd raised, the man who'd tried to kill me, the predator who'd murdered innocent elderly people for money, gone. "How?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "It's being ruled a suicide," Detective Chin said carefully. "He was found hanging in his cell during the morning count. There'll be an investigation, of course, but preliminary findings suggest he took his own life." Suicide. The final act of a coward who couldn't face the consequences of his actions. Or maybe something else entirely. Prison justice delivered by inmates who'd grown tired of sharing space with someone who'd murdered grandmothers and grandfathers. I should have felt something in that moment. Relief, maybe. Sadness for the boy he'd once been. Some kind of closure now that the monster who'd tried to kill me was gone forever. But instead, all I felt was empty. Hollow. Like a part of me had been carved out and discarded. "Mr. Castellano? Are you still there?" "I'm here," I said. "Thank you for letting me know. There's something else," Detective Chin continued. "We found a letter in his cell. It's addressed to you." The prison administration has to review it first, but if you want to read it. No, I said immediately. I don't want to read anything he wrote. Whatever he had to say, he should have said it before he tried to murder me. But even as I spoke those words, I knew I was lying. Some part of me, maybe the part that remembered teaching a 6-year-old boy to ride a bicycle, desperately wanted to know what Danny's final words had been. Had he found remorse? Had he finally understood the magnitude of what he'd done? Had he thought about his victims in those final moments? I'll have the letter destroyed if you prefer, Detective Chen offered. Give me a few days to think about it, I said. After I hung up, I sat in my living room for hours, staring at the spot where Danny had sat on that terrible night 2 years ago. The chair had been replaced. I couldn't bear to look at it after everything that had happened, but I could still see him there in my mind's eye, explaining why he was going to let me die. The news of his death spread quickly. It made the local papers, and even some national news outlets picked up the story because of the unusual nature of his crimes. Son who tried to murder father for inheritance found dead in prison. The headlines wrote themselves. I started getting calls from reporters wanting comments, from victims' families asking how I felt, from acquaintances offering condolences that felt hollow and inappropriate. How do you console someone for the death of a person who tried to kill them? What's the proper etiquette for mourning a murderer? 3 days after Detective Chen's call, I made a decision that surprised even me. I drove to the prison to collect Danny's letter. The envelope was thin, containing maybe 2 or 3 pages at most. My name was written on the outside in Danny's familiar handwriting, the same careful script he'd used to forge documents and manipulate elderly victims. Even in his final act, there was something calculating about the way he'd addressed it. I didn't open it right away. I carried it home and set it on my kitchen table, where it sat like a loaded gun for another 2 days. Finally, on a Thursday evening while a spring storm raged outside, I opened a bottle of whiskey, sat down at that table, and read my dead son's final words. The letter was exactly what I'd expected and nothing like what I'd hoped for. Dad, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I know you probably think this is the coward's way out, and maybe you're right. But I can't do this anymore. I can't live with what I've become, and I can't face the rest of my life in this place. I want you to know that I never meant for things to go as far as they did. When I started taking money from those old people, I told myself I was just borrowing it, that I'd pay them back when I got my gambling debts sorted out. But it spiraled out of control so fast, and before I knew it, I was doing things I never thought I was capable of. Margaret didn't suffer. I want you to know that. She hit her head on the way down the stairs and was unconscious immediately. Robert, too, the heart attack was quick. I know that doesn't make it better, but I needed you to know that I didn't torture anyone. I'm not a sadist. But you, what I did to you was different. What I was planning to do to you was different. You were my father, and I was going to let you die slowly, in pain, alone. I was going to sit in the next room and listen to you suffer because I needed the money more than I needed you alive. I know you'll never forgive me for that. I wouldn't forgive me either. But I need you to understand that it wasn't really me in that room with you that night. It was this desperate, terrified person who'd taken over my body and my mind. The son you raised would never have done that to you. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry for all of it. I'm sorry for the people I killed, I'm sorry for the families I destroyed, and I'm sorry for making you question everything you believed about love and family and trust. You deserve better than the son you got. Please don't blame yourself for how I turned out. You were a good father. You gave me every opportunity, every advantage, every bit of love a child could ask for. What I became was my choice, not your failure. I hope someday you can remember the boy I used to be instead of the monster I became. Danny. I read the letter 3 times, and each time I felt the same mixture of rage and heartbreak and bitter disappointment. Even in death, even in his final moments, Danny was still trying to manipulate me. Still trying to make excuses for what he'd done. Still trying to minimize his crimes by claiming his victims didn't suffer, and that he wasn't really himself when he'd committed those murders. The boy who'd written birthday cards with crayon drawings, who'd hugged me tight after nightmares, who'd cried when our dog died, that boy had disappeared years ago, replaced by a calculating predator who saw other people as resources to exploit. And no amount of regret or self-pity was going to bring that boy back. I burned the letter that night, watching Danny's final words turn to ash in my fireplace. Some things, I'd learned, don't deserve to be preserved. The next morning, I made a series of phone calls. To Susan Hoffman, Margaret's daughter. To Robert Chen's brother in Miami. To Dorothy Walsh's niece in Colorado. To all the families who'd been touched by Danny's crimes. I told them that their loved one's killer was dead, and that he'd left behind a letter full of excuses and self-pity but very little genuine remorse. Good, Susan said when I finished explaining. I hope he suffered. I hope those last 2 years in prison were hell for him. They were, I assured her. Prison wasn't kind to someone who'd killed elderly people. His protective custody was more like solitary confinement, and even that wasn't enough to keep him completely safe. We talked for another hour about closure, about justice, about the strange mixture of satisfaction and emptiness that comes with knowing your loved one's killer is finally gone. Susan had struggled with anger and grief for the past 2 years, and Danny's death didn't magically solve those problems, but it did provide a sense of finality that court convictions couldn't match. Over the next few weeks, I found myself thinking about legacy. About what we leave behind when we're gone, and how the people we hurt continue carrying that pain long after we're no longer around to face consequences for it. Danny's legacy was pain. Families torn apart, elderly people who died afraid and alone, a father who'd learned that love wasn't always returned or even appreciated. He'd left behind a trail of trauma that would persist for decades, affecting not just his direct victims but their children, their grandchildren, everyone who'd been touched by his crimes. But maybe my legacy could be different. Maybe instead of just focusing on revenge and justice and making Danny pay for his crimes, I could do something positive with whatever years I had left. That's when I decided to establish the Margaret Hoffman Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting elderly people from financial fraud and abuse. Using the money from my estate that Danny had been so eager to inherit, I created a resource center that provided education about elder fraud, support for victims' families, and advocacy for stronger legal protections for vulnerable seniors. The foundation's website featured photos and stories of Danny's victims, not to shame him, since he was beyond shame now, but to honor their memories and make sure they weren't forgotten. Margaret's love of gardening. Robert's pride in his military service. Dorothy's decades of teaching children to read. These weren't just statistics or case files. They were real people with real lives who deserved better than what they got. If you've ever lost someone you loved to violence, if you've ever struggled with how to honor their memory while dealing with your own pain and anger, then you know that healing isn't about forgetting or forgiving. Sometimes healing is about action. Sometimes it's about making sure that other people don't have to go through what you've been through. The foundation grew quickly, funded not just by my estate but by donations from other families who'd lost elderly relatives to fraud and abuse. We provided educational seminars at senior centers, lobbied for stronger penalties for elder abuse, and created support groups for families dealing with the aftermath of financial exploitation. We also worked with law enforcement agencies to identify patterns of elder abuse earlier, before predators like Danny could claim multiple victims. We developed training materials for financial institutions to help them recognize when elderly customers were being manipulated or coerced. It wasn't enough to bring back Margaret or Robert or Dorothy or any of the others Danny had killed. Nothing could do that. But it was something positive, something constructive, something that honored their memories while protecting other vulnerable people from similar fates. 3 years after Danny's death, the foundation had prevented an estimated 47 cases of elder fraud and helped recover over $2 million that had been stolen from elderly victims. We'd trained hundreds of bank employees, social workers, and healthcare providers to recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation. Most importantly, we'd created a community of people who understood that protecting the elderly wasn't just about laws and regulations. It was about treating our seniors with the dignity and respect they'd earned through decades of hard work and contribution to society. Danny had seen elderly people as easy targets, vulnerable marks to exploit for financial gain. The Foundation saw them as treasures to protect, wisdom keepers to honor, beloved family members who deserved safety and security in their golden years. That contrast, between Danny's predatory worldview and the Foundation's protective mission, became the defining difference between his legacy and mine. He'd left behind pain. I was determined to leave behind protection. He'd created victims. I was working to prevent victimization. He'd destroyed families. I was helping families heal and stay together. Standing at my kitchen window 5 years after that terrible night when Danny had locked me in my bedroom, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. I'd survived attempted murder, seen my son convicted and imprisoned, watched him die by his own hand, and somehow found a way to transform all that darkness into something resembling light. The heart attack Danny had tried to kill me with had ultimately made me stronger. The betrayal he'd inflicted had taught me about the depths of human cruelty, but also about the heights of human resilience. The justice I'd sought had evolved from simple revenge into something more complex and ultimately more satisfying, the creation of lasting change that would protect other families from experiencing what mine had endured. If Danny could see me now, I wondered what he'd think. Would he understand that his greatest crime hadn't been trying to kill me, but in underestimating what I was capable of once I'd survived his attempt? Would he realize that by trying to destroy me, he'd actually freed me to become someone I'd never imagined I could be? The old Frank Castellano had died in that locked room, just as surely as if Danny's plan had succeeded. But the man who'd emerged from that experience was harder, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous to anyone who would prey on the vulnerable. Danny had thought he was inheriting money when he killed me. Instead, he'd inherited something far more powerful, the wrath of a father who'd learned that love without limits can become a weapon when that love is betrayed. And that weapon had been used not just for revenge, but for protection. Not just for justice, but for prevention. Not just to punish one predator, but to shield countless potential victims from future predators. In the end, Danny's greatest failure wasn't that his murder plan had gone wrong. It was that he'd created an enemy far more formidable than he'd ever imagined, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The student had become the teacher. And the lesson I was teaching was simple: if you hurt innocent people, if you prey on the vulnerable, if you betray the trust of those who love you, there will be consequences that reach far beyond any courtroom or prison cell. Some debts can only be paid in full through a lifetime of vigilance, protection, and the absolute determination to ensure that other families never have to endure what mine had endured. That was Danny's final gift to the world, not the pain he'd caused, but the response that pain had generated. Not the darkness he'd created, but the light that had emerged from that darkness. He'd tried to take everything from me. Instead, he'd given me a purpose that would define the rest of my life. As I write these words, I'm 76 years old. 5 years have passed since Danny's death, 8 years since that night when he locked me in my bedroom and waited for me to die. The Margaret Hoffman Foundation has grown into a national organization with offices in 12 states, and we've helped prevent over 300 cases of elder fraud, recovering more than $15 million for victims and their families. But today, I'm not writing about foundations or fraud prevention or any of the good work we've managed to accomplish. Today, I'm writing about something that happened 3 weeks ago that brought everything full circle in a way I never could have expected. I received a phone call from a young woman named Sarah Castellano. The name stopped me cold, not because I recognized it, but because of what it represented. Castellano? My family name. Our family name. Mr. Castellano, she said, her voice nervous but determined. I know this might sound strange, but I think I might be your granddaughter. The words hit me like a physical blow. Granddaughter. Danny had never mentioned having a child, had never said anything about being in a serious relationship, had never given me any indication that I might have a grandchild somewhere in the world. I'm sorry, I said, struggling to process what I was hearing. Could you repeat that? My name is Sarah Castellano, and I'm 22 years old. My mother was Jennifer Walsh. She died when I was 16, and she always told me that my father was a man named Daniel Castellano from New York. I've been trying to find him for years, and when I finally tracked him down... Her voice broke. When I finally found him, I discovered that he was in prison for trying to murder his own father. And then I found out that he died in prison 2 years ago. Jennifer Walsh. The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it immediately. Then it hit me. Jennifer Walsh was Dorothy Walsh's great-niece. Dorothy, one of Danny's elderly victims. The 80-year-old retired teacher he'd murdered in what police had ruled a home invasion. The implications were staggering. Danny had been involved with Dorothy's great-niece while he was planning Dorothy's murder. He'd fathered a child with a member of the family he was manipulating and destroying. Sarah, I said carefully, I think you should come see me. There are things you need to know about your father, things that are going to be very difficult to hear. She drove up from Philadelphia the next weekend, and when she knocked on my door, I saw Danny's face staring back at me. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same intelligent expression that could shift between charming and calculating in an instant. But there was something else there too, something softer, more genuine, that I remembered from Danny's early childhood before the darkness took hold. We sat in my living room, the same room where Danny had waited for me to die, and I told Sarah everything. About her father's crimes, about the elderly people he'd murdered for money, about how he tried to kill me, about his death in prison. I told her about her great-great-aunt Dorothy, and how Danny had killed her while he was supposedly in love with Dorothy's great-niece. Sarah listened to it all with the kind of horrified fascination that comes with learning that your entire understanding of the world has been built on lies. When I finished, she sat in silence for several minutes, tears streaming down her face. I always wondered why he never contacted me, she finally said. My mother told me he was busy with work, that he traveled a lot, that he sent money when he could but couldn't be part of my life. I thought maybe he just wasn't ready to be a father. I never imagined he was a serial killer. He wasn't just a serial killer, I said, choosing my words carefully. He was also your father. And regardless of what he did, regardless of the monster he became, you're still his daughter. You're still my granddaughter. And none of his crimes are your fault or your responsibility. We talked for hours that day. Sarah told me about growing up without a father, about her mother Jennifer's struggles with addiction and depression after Dorothy's death, about how she'd managed to put herself through college working 3 jobs because she'd been determined not to let her circumstances define her future. She was studying social work, she said, because she wanted to help people who'd been dealt bad hands in life. She wanted to work with children in foster care, kids who'd been abandoned or abused by the adults who were supposed to protect them. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Danny's daughter had chosen to dedicate her life to helping the kinds of vulnerable people her father had spent his life exploiting. I need to ask you something, Sarah said as our conversation wound down. I need to know if you think I'm like him. If you think there's something in me that could turn dark the way he did. I've been terrified of that my whole life, terrified that I inherited whatever made him capable of those things. I looked at this young woman, my granddaughter, the child I'd never known existed, and saw something that gave me hope. She was asking the right questions. She was worried about doing harm. She was choosing to help people rather than exploit them. Those weren't the thoughts or choices of someone with Danny's twisted psychology. Sarah, I said, your father's problems weren't genetic. They were choices. He chose greed over integrity, manipulation over honesty, violence over compassion. You're already proving that you're making different choices. She stayed for the entire weekend, and by the time she left, we'd made plans for her to move closer to Syracuse after she graduated. The Margaret Hoffman Foundation needed someone with her background and passion, and she needed family. The kind of family that would support her dreams instead of exploiting her vulnerabilities. Over the next few months, Sarah became a regular part of my life. She helped me understand parts of Danny's story that I'd never known, how he'd met her mother at a college party, how he'd charmed Jennifer into believing he was a successful businessman, how he'd disappeared from their lives when Sarah was just a baby without ever explaining why. Jennifer had spent years trying to understand why the man she'd loved had abandoned their child. She'd blamed herself, wondering if she'd done something wrong or if she wasn't good enough to keep him interested. She'd never known that Danny had left because he was busy establishing himself as a predator who targeted elderly people for their money. In many ways, Jennifer had been one of Danny's victims too. He'd stolen her trust, her self-worth, and her ability to form healthy relationships. She'd struggled with depression and substance abuse for years, and she'd died young, at 41, from complications related to her addiction. Sarah had grown up knowing that her father was absent, and her mother was broken, but she'd never understood why. Learning the truth about Danny's crimes provided answers to questions that had haunted her entire life, but it also opened new wounds that we're still working together to heal. She started coming to Foundation events, sharing her story with other families who'd been affected by elder fraud and abuse. Her perspective, as the child of a perpetrator rather than a victim, brought a unique dimension to our work that helped people understand how these crimes ripple through generations. "My father destroyed so many lives," she said at one of our fundraising dinners. "But I refuse to let him destroy mine. I refuse to let his legacy be the only thing our family is remembered for. I want to be part of building something better." Watching Sarah speak that night, seeing her transform her pain into purpose, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pride in a member of my family. For so long, the Castellano name had been associated with betrayal, murder, and the worst kinds of family dysfunction. But here was Sarah, working to change that narrative, using her father's crimes as motivation to help other people rather than as an excuse to give up on humanity. She's finishing her master's degree in social work now, and she'll be joining the foundation full-time next month. We're creating a new program focused on supporting the children and families of people who commit crimes against the elderly, helping them process their shame and guilt and find ways to contribute positively to society despite their connection to perpetrators. It's work that Sarah is uniquely qualified to do, and it's work that transforms Danny's legacy in ways he never could have imagined. Instead of just being remembered as the man who killed elderly people for money, he'll also be remembered as the father of someone who dedicated her life to protecting vulnerable people. That transformation didn't happen by accident. It happened because Sarah made choices, conscious, deliberate choices to be different than her father, to use her pain as fuel for compassion rather than bitterness, to honor her murdered great-great-aunt's memory by becoming someone Dorothy would have been proud to know. If you've ever struggled with guilt about things your family members have done, if you've ever worried that you might be destined to repeat their mistakes, if you've ever felt ashamed of your last name or your bloodline, then take some comfort in Sarah's story. We don't have to be defined by our relatives' failures. We can choose to be better than the worst examples in our family trees. Standing at my kitchen window this morning, watching Sarah pull into my driveway for our weekly Sunday breakfast, I found myself thinking about the strange journey that had brought us to this moment. 8 years ago, I was a trusting father who believed that love was always returned, that family bonds were unbreakable, that people who hurt you would eventually see the error of their ways and make amends. That man died in a locked bedroom while his son waited for a heart attack to finish the job. The man who survived learned hard truths about the limits of love, the reality of evil, and the necessity of protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit them. But he also learned something unexpected: that even the darkest betrayals can sometimes lead to unexpected gifts. Danny tried to kill me for money, and in doing so, he gave me a purpose that has defined the most meaningful years of my life. He abandoned his daughter, and in doing so, he gave me a granddaughter who shares my commitment to protecting people who can't protect themselves. He destroyed the naive faith I'd had in unconditional love, and in doing so, he taught me that earned trust and chosen family can be stronger than blood relations. None of this excuses what Danny did. Nothing can bring back Margaret, or Robert, or Dorothy, or any of his other victims. Nothing can erase the pain he caused or the families he destroyed. But sometimes, from the ashes of terrible things, unexpected beauty can grow. Sarah represents that beauty. The foundation represents that beauty. The hundreds of elderly people who've been protected from fraud because of the systems we've created represent that beauty. Danny thought he was taking everything from me when he locked me in that room. Instead, he was setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately make my life more meaningful than it had ever been before. He thought he was ending my story. Instead, he was giving me the most important chapter. And now, as I prepare to pass the Foundation's leadership to Sarah, as I watch her take the pain of her father's crimes and transform it into protection for other people's grandparents, I realize that the best revenge isn't making your enemies suffer. The best revenge is making their worst actions become the foundation for your greatest achievements. The best revenge is proving that love can be stronger than betrayal, that hope can survive horror, and that sometimes the children of monsters can become heroes. Danny destroyed lives. Sarah saves them. Danny created victims. Sarah protects potential victims. Danny abandoned his responsibilities. Sarah embraces them. That's his real legacy, not the pain he caused, but the determination he inspired in the people who survived him to make sure that pain had meaning, had purpose, had power to change things for the better. Every elderly person the Foundation helps is a victory over Danny's philosophy that vulnerable people exist.